The year was 1847. Georgia's summer heat hung heavy over Wilkes County, and the Caldwell estate sat proudly on a rise that overlooked miles of cotton fields swaying like a white ocean under the sun. From a distance, it looked serene, the perfect picture of Southern elegance. But as with most beautiful things in that era, the perfection was only skin-deep. Locals called it the house on the hill, a grand mansion with white columns so tall they seemed to scrape the sky. Its wraparound porch gleamed freshly painted, the gardens were perfectly trimmed, and at night, the soft glow of oil lamps flickered through lace-curtained windows. To passing travelers, it symbolized wealth, respectability, and the Southern way of life. But inside those walls, silence carried weight. The kind of silence that hides whispers. The master of the house, Thomas Caldwell, was a man known for two things: his sprawling cotton empire and his twin daughters, Elizabeth and Catherine. He'd raised them alone since the night their mother died giving them life. Some said he never truly recovered. Others believed he poured every ounce of affection and control into those girls, determined that their lives would mirror the perfection he demanded from his land. At 22, the twins were considered late to marry. Suitors had come and gone, drawn by beauty and wealth, yet something about the sisters unsettled people. Perhaps it was their eerie similarity, not just in face, but in manner, in speech, even in the quiet glances they shared that seemed to carry whole conversations. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, a restlessness in their eyes that polite society couldn't name, but could certainly feel. They were expected to host teas, smile sweetly, and accept the futures arranged for them. But deep down, both knew the world laid before them was not theirs. Catherine often spent her mornings wandering the stables, claiming she loved the smell of horses more than perfume. Elizabeth preferred the gardens, where the enslaved men tended to the magnolias and roses. Their father disapproved of these habits but tolerated them. After all, what harm could come from two young women walking among their father's property? Yet, unbeknownst to him, those quiet paths through the estate were about to rewrite the Caldwell name forever. Because in the stables worked a man named Samuel, tall, soft-spoken, and far more intelligent than anyone dared admit aloud. And among the gardens moved another, Elijah, steady-handed, thoughtful, and sharp-eyed. Both were enslaved, bought years earlier from a South Carolina plantation that had fallen into ruin. But they carried with them something dangerous for men in their position: education. They could read. They could write. In the South of 1847, that simple truth was an act of rebellion. The discovery came by accident. A late evening when Catherine wandered into the stables and caught Samuel quietly reading a discarded newspaper by lantern light. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something began. Not love, not yet, but recognition. The spark of seeing another human soul in a world that pretended he was not one. From that night, the rhythms of the Caldwell plantation began to shift. What had once been routine, the morning bell, the hum of work, the distant laughter from a house, now felt charged with something unseen. A secret was taking root. And as that secret grew, the beautiful house on the hill, with all its symmetry and order, began to tremble ever so slightly at its foundations. Because behind every immaculate Southern mansion lay cracks the eye could not see, and sometimes it only took two hearts, and the courage to feel what they weren't supposed to make the whole facade begin to crumble. If you had walked through Wilkes County in the spring of 1847 and asked anyone about the Caldwell twins, you would have heard the same answer: beautiful girls, almost too alike to tell apart. But beneath that surface perfection, Elizabeth and Catherine Caldwell were two halves of a restless heart, bound together by blood, by loss, and by a quiet ache neither dared to speak aloud. They had been motherless since birth. The story was whispered in the county. Their mother, Amelia, had died in childbirth, leaving Thomas Caldwell, a man more comfortable among ledgers and cotton yields than the cries of newborns, to raise them alone. He never remarried. Some said he couldn't bear to love again. Others thought he simply loved control too much to share it. The twins grew up in a world of rules disguised as love. Mornings filled with tutors, piano practice, and embroidery lessons. Evenings at dinner, where silence was the language of obedience. Their father's word was law, and affection was earned, not given. Yet, when they were alone, behind closed doors, hair unpinned, laughter spilling into whispers, Elizabeth and Catherine imagined other lives. They devoured the few novels that slipped into the house from visiting relatives, stories of distant places, of courage and forbidden choices. They talked of the world beyond the plantation fence like it was a dream half-remembered. Catherine was the bolder one, always curious, always questioning. Elizabeth, the gentler soul, was drawn to beauty, the garden, the poetry, the quiet moments that made her feel free. But what made them inseparable was how one finished the other's sentences, how one's thought seemed to echo in the other's mind. To the world, they were identical. To each other, they were a mirror, each reflecting what the other feared to admit. Still, even mirrors can hide cracks. By 22, their father had begun to worry. "A Caldwell woman should be a wife by now," he'd mutter over dinner, glancing at his daughters as if they were investments left idle. He arranged social gatherings, encouraged visits from eligible bachelors, the sons of other plantation owners. Yet every introduction ended the same way: polite smiles from the twins, awkward compliments from the suitors, and a lingering unease no one could quite name. The truth was simple: the twins didn't fit the mold they'd been born into. They played the roles expected of them, but their hearts were somewhere else, untethered, searching. At night, when the lamps were low and the rest of the house slept, Catherine would slip onto Elizabeth's bed and whisper, "Do you ever feel like we're living someone else's life?" Elizabeth would smile faintly. Every day. Those late-night conversations became their secret rebellion, small, quiet acts of resistance. They spoke of what freedom might feel like, though neither truly understood what that word meant. Not yet. Outside, the world was changing in ways the South refused to see. Whispers of abolition grew louder in northern cities. Pamphlets, smuggled south through secret channels, spoke of human rights and liberty. But in Wilkes County, those were dangerous words, words that could get a man whipped or worse. And yet, in that world of silence and obedience, two women began to listen, not to the sermons of their society, but to something deeper. It started as curiosity, then compassion. And slowly, it became something even more perilous: awareness. By the time spring melted into the heavy warmth of summer, the Caldwell twins had begun walking the fields more often, lingering near the stables, near the quarters. Not because they sought trouble, but because something inside them had begun to awaken. They didn't yet know it, but they were standing at the edge of a choice that would change everything. Long before their names became legend, Samuel and Elijah were simply two men trying to survive in a world built to erase them. The Caldwell plantation kept roughly 70 enslaved people, not the largest in Georgia, but enough to maintain the illusion of prosperity. For Thomas Caldwell, they were part of the machinery that kept his empire running: strong backs, bowed heads, and silence. But in that sea of obedience were two men who carried something far more dangerous than defiance: knowledge. Samuel had been sold to the Caldwells 5 years earlier. He was tall, quiet, with eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense. In another world, he might have been a teacher, maybe even a philosopher. He had learned to read in secret, taught by the children of his previous master in South Carolina. When the plantation fell into debt, Samuel was sold, and with him, that forbidden skill. He hid it carefully. A misplaced word or curious glance could mean a beating, even death. Elijah arrived not long after, younger, broad-shouldered, quick with his hands, the kind of man who could repair anything from a wagon wheel to a cracked door hinge. His calm demeanor made him well-liked among the others, but his sharp mind made him dangerous in the eyes of those who noticed too much. He, too, had once known kindness in a small way, a mistress's daughter who had taught him his letters as a child before her family discovered and punished them both. When they came to the Caldwell estate, both men learned to keep their heads down. They spoke little, listened much, and observed everything. But even careful men can't hide forever. One late autumn evening, Catherine Caldwell wandered into the stables. The night was unusually cold, and the wind rattled the doors like bones. There, under the faint glow of a lantern, she saw Samuel hunched over a scrap of old newspaper. He didn't hear her at first. His lips moved silently, reading, words he wasn't supposed to know. Catherine froze. For a moment, she didn't breathe. Then Samuel looked up, startled, the paper slipping from his hands. Neither spoke. It was the first time Catherine had looked into the eyes of someone she'd been told was less than human, and seen not fear, but intelligence, awareness. Something shifted in her that night, quietly, like a door unlocking in her heart. Instead of reporting him, she returned. Again and again. Sometimes she brought discarded books from her room, claiming she'd lost them. Sometimes she brought nothing at all, only questions. They began to talk, cautiously at first, then freely. About the world, about freedom, about the strange invisible walls that trapped them both in different cages. Meanwhile, in the gardens, Elijah began to notice Elizabeth. She was often there alone, kneeling beside the flowers, her hands tracing the soil as if she could feel the life beneath. He admired her gentleness, her quiet strength. One day, seeing her struggle with a heavy watering can, he stepped forward to help. Their eyes met, and though neither spoke, something passed between them, something unmistakable. That's how it began, not in some grand act of defiance, but in small moments of humanity, shared words, lingering glances, stolen smiles. In a world where every relationship between master and enslaved was defined by power, theirs was something entirely different, dangerous precisely because it was equal. By winter's arrival, the invisible lines that separated the Caldwells and their enslaved had begun to blur. And in that dangerous crossing, Samuel and Elijah found themselves bound not by chains, but by love that would soon test the limits of courage itself. By the winter of 1846, the Caldwell plantation had grown quieter than usual. Frost clung to the fences, and the air smelled of smoke and damp earth. Inside the great house, Thomas Caldwell fretted over the failing cotton stores and the persistent melancholy that seemed to hang over his daughters. But he couldn't see what was truly happening, or perhaps he chose not to. Because while the house slept, its heart was beginning to beat to a forbidden rhythm. Catherine's meetings with Samuel had deepened into something neither could control. What began as curiosity, a fascination with a man who could read the world in secret, had become an emotional tether, invisible but unbreakable. She met him most often at the edge of the oak grove behind the stables, where the moonlight broke through the branches in silver shards. Sometimes they said nothing at all. Sometimes they talked until dawn, about faith, about injustice, about the strange unfairness of being born into opposite sides of the same cage. Catherine once confessed, her voice trembling, "I feel as though I live behind glass, Samuel. Everyone can see me, but no one knows me." He looked at her for a long moment before replying, "You're freer than you know. You can walk away from that glass. I can't." That truth hung between them like a blade. And yet, the more she understood his pain, the less she could live with her own comfort. Across the estate, Elizabeth was facing the same storm, quietly, delicately, with Elijah. He'd started leaving small tokens near the garden gate, a carved wooden bird, a sprig of wild jasmine, a single folded note with no words, only a drawing of two joined hands. She kept them hidden beneath her pillow like holy relics. Her affection frightened her. Loving him meant betrayal, not only of her father's world but of everything she'd been taught to believe was proper, moral, and right. Yet, when she looked into Elijah's eyes, she saw something purer than any sermon she'd ever heard. Still, fear was their constant shadow. One wrong glance, one whispered rumor, and both men could be killed. The women knew it. The men knew it. And yet, the heart has never been one for logic. Then came the first snow of that year, light, fleeting, and rare in Georgia. The twins stood by their window, watching the flakes drift over the fields where Samuel and Elijah worked. Elizabeth whispered, "Do you ever think there's a world where this isn't a sin?" Catherine smiled faintly. "Maybe that's the world we have to make." But the walls were closing in. A letter from the housekeeper, Margaret Sullivan, to her sister in Savannah, discovered more than a century later, hinted at the tension. "The young missus spend too much time in the quarters. The master says little, though I fear he knows more than he admits." Whispers had begun. The overseer, James Whittaker, watched with suspicion. Servants exchanged uneasy glances. And still, the twins didn't stop. They met in secret, guided by love and the thrill of danger. In Catherine's diary, found years later, one entry simply read, "We cannot unsee what love has shown us." What they didn't realize was that the cost of what they were feeling was already being calculated, not in money, but in lives. The night would soon come when love and survival could no longer coexist. And when it did, the house on the hill would never be the same again. The night of March 17, 1847, began like any other, warm wind moving through the oaks, the fields quiet, the lamps burning low in the Caldwell house. But for four people, that night was no ordinary evening. It was the edge of a cliff. For months, the twins and the two men had been living between two worlds, bound by affection, trapped by fear. Every whispered meeting carried the weight of discovery. Every smile held the knowledge that one misstep could end in blood. Catherine's diary from that winter hints at the breaking point. Father has made arrangements for us, marriages, alliances, bargains. I smiled when he told us. But inside, something shattered. The men he had chosen were wealthy planters' sons from neighboring counties, respectable, predictable, and utterly cold. To Thomas Caldwell, it was a victory. To his daughters, it was a death sentence in lace. That night, Catherine and Elizabeth met in secret in Elizabeth's room. Between them lay two small bundles, clothes, a bit of money, a locket each, and a single folded note written by Catherine in trembling hand. "We leave tomorrow," she said softly. "Not separately. Together." Elizabeth stared at her, terrified. "Do you understand what that means?" Catherine's voice barely rose above a whisper. "It means we finally live." Down by the stables, Samuel and Elijah waited. Their plan had been built piece by piece over weeks: a quiet fire to draw attention, the use of old back trails known only to those who had worked the land their whole lives, a wagon hidden by the oak grove, and allies along the way connected to what Samuel had heard whispered in secret, the Underground Railroad. When Catherine slipped from the house, her white gown catching the moonlight, Samuel was already there. Their eyes met, no words, just understanding. Beside them, Elizabeth approached, clutching Elijah's hand. For a heartbeat, the four of them stood together beneath the Georgia sky, two daughters of privilege and two men who had lived in chains, bound now by something no law could define. Samuel reached into his pocket and produced a small folded paper, the kind used for plantation records. But on it, in his neat handwriting, were words no one expected to see: marriage certificate. Two, in fact. One for Catherine Caldwell and Samuel, and another for Elizabeth Caldwell and Elijah. Crude and signed by clergy, yet sacred in its intent. He looked at the sisters and said quietly, "If we die on that road, let it be as husband and wife. Not master and slave. Not mistress and servant." Elizabeth's hands shook as she took the paper. "Do you think God will see it that way?" Samuel smiled faintly. "I think he already does." They signed them by the lantern's flicker, trembling, hurried, but resolute. 4 names sealed in defiance of an entire world. Then, as the clock struck midnight, Elizabeth walked toward the storage sheds and lit the fire. The flames climbed fast, not to destroy, but to distract, while the overseer and servants rushed to contain it, for shadows slipped into the woods beyond the fields. The wind carried the crackle of fire behind them, but ahead was only silence, and the sound of their own footsteps on the path to freedom. In her final entry before that night, Catherine wrote, "Tomorrow, we leave everything we have known for an uncertain future. We may find freedom or death, but either is better than living a lie." And so they vanished. By sunrise, the Caldwell estate awoke to chaos. The fire smoldered, the daughters' rooms lay empty, and Samuel and Elijah were gone. What began as a whisper of love had become a rebellion, one that would haunt the South for generations. Dawn broke over the Caldwell plantation like an accusation. The faint smoke from the night's fire still curled into the air, and the once orderly world Thomas Caldwell ruled over had fallen into chaos. The overseer, James Whitaker, was the first to notice what was missing. Not the tools, not the wagons, but people. Samuel, Elijah, and both Caldwell daughters. By mid-morning, the entire estate buzzed with panic. Servants were interrogated, horses saddled, neighbors summoned. Within hours, the story began to spread. 2 enslaved men had vanished, and the Caldwell twins were gone with them. The assumption was immediate: the men had abducted them. The idea that the daughters of a wealthy plantation owner could go willingly with enslaved men was so unthinkable that no one dared even suggest it aloud. Thomas Caldwell's fury was legendary that day. Witnesses later said his voice could be heard from the front porch clear down to the quarters. He rode from one end of the property to the other, shouting orders, threatening punishment, demanding answers no one could give. He couldn't, or wouldn't, believe his daughters were complicit. To him, this was not betrayal but crime, a violent disruption of the social order that defined his world. The sheriff was called. Handbills were printed offering a reward for the safe return of Elizabeth and Catherine and for the capture and punishment of the fugitives Samuel and Elijah. Search parties spread through the neighboring counties, fanning out across roads and rivers. The woods were combed, swamps searched, wagons stopped, and strangers questioned. But there was nothing. No footprints, no discarded belongings, no trace of the twins or the men. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed them. In the weeks that followed, the search turned desperate. Thomas Caldwell stopped sleeping. He stopped eating. He sat for hours on the porch staring into the fields, waiting for riders to return with news. When none came, his anger turned inward, then to grief. On April 12th, his health collapsed. The family physician diagnosed apoplexy, what we would now call a stroke. He lingered for 3 days, barely conscious, murmuring the same words over and over, "Find them, bring them home." He never knew that the letter arriving just before his death held the truth he could not face. Its contents were never made public, but those who saw it said the moment he read it, his face drained of color. Within minutes, he collapsed, clutching his chest. 3 days later, he was gone. When his brother, Edward Caldwell, arrived from Charleston to settle the estate, he found a house frozen in mourning, portraits draped, curtains drawn, servants moving like ghosts through the halls. But behind the grief was something else: fear. As Edward began to sort through his late brother's affairs, he found a small wooden box hidden in the study desk. Inside were 2 papers, crudely written but unmistakable, marriage certificates. Elizabeth Caldwell to Elijah. Catherine Caldwell to Samuel. And a letter, Catherine's handwriting, calm and deliberate. "We did not run away. We chose to leave. Father would never have understood, but love is not theft. We go north, to a place where we can live without fear. Please forgive us if you can." Edward read it once, then again. Then, silently, he locked the box, buried it among family papers, and burned the rest. The official story would be the one the South could live with. The twins had been taken, not complicit, victims, not rebels. And so, the Caldwell legend began, a tale of abduction and tragedy whispered for generations, hiding the truth of 2 women who had chosen love over power. It would take more than a century for the real story to resurface. But for now, the lie suited everyone just fine. The road north was long, dangerous, and silent. For 6 weeks, the 4 fugitives moved by moonlight, resting in abandoned barns, hiding in thickets during daylight, and surviving on what little food sympathetic strangers could spare. They followed whispers, routes passed from one frightened traveler to another, the secret veins of the Underground Railroad. In each safe house, they were met not with questions but with quiet nods and candlelight. By late April 1847, they crossed into free soil. Philadelphia. For the first time, they could walk without glancing over their shoulders. Yet freedom, as they soon learned, did not erase fear, it only changed its shape. They took new names. Catherine became Margaret Johnson. Samuel became Samuel Johnson. Elizabeth and Elijah chose Elizabeth and Elijah Davis. The new identities were more than protection, they were rebirth. In Samuel's journal, discovered more than a century later, he described their arrival. "We came into the city at dawn. The bells of Christ Church were ringing. Catherine wept at the sound. She said it was the first morning she had ever felt the world belonged to her." They found refuge in a small neighborhood of free black families and abolitionist allies. Samuel, skilled with horses, soon found work at a livery stable. Catherine, under the guise of a widowed seamstress, began mending garments for neighbors. Elizabeth and Elijah, restless for something quieter, traveled further north to Boston, and later to a small Massachusetts farming town. There, Elijah worked as a carpenter, while Elizabeth began teaching local children to read, a secret passion born from the man she once wasn't supposed to speak to. Freedom wasn't perfect. They lived in constant fear of discovery, especially after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which made even the North unsafe for those who had escaped. They moved often, never staying long enough for suspicion to take root. Catherine and Samuel shifted homes every 2 years, always packing quickly, always ready to run. Still, in those years, something beautiful bloomed. Catherine gave birth to 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. Elizabeth had 2. Their homes were humble, but filled with laughter, song, and the kind of love that had once been a crime. Neighbors would later recall how Margaret Johnson, as she was known, spoke with unusual grace for a seamstress. How she read bedtime stories to her children with an accent they couldn't quite place. How Samuel, quiet but proud, seemed to carry an invisible sorrow, as though part of him had stayed behind in Georgia's red soil. At night, the sisters wrote letters to each other, careful, coded, and signed only with initials. Some of those letters survive. The lilacs bloom here. They remind me of home, though I no longer know what that word means. Freedom is heavy, but beautiful. I pray we never have to run again. They were not merely fugitives, they were architects of new lives, building families from the ashes of the old world. And yet, the past had a way of finding them. In 1865, after the Civil War ended, a rumor reached Catherine. The Caldwell plantation was in ruins, her uncle still alive, guarding its last remnants. For nearly 2 decades, she had lived as someone else. But now, for the first time, she felt the pull of who she used to be. Samuel begged her not to go. But Catherine's heart told her that freedom meant more than running away. It meant facing what you'd left behind. And so, against his pleas, she made the journey home, one last time. It was the summer of 1865, the war was over, and the South was in ruins. Plantations once symbols of pride and power now stood like ghosts, broken fences, burned barns, empty fields where cotton no longer grew. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Catherine, now Margaret Johnson, stepped back onto Georgia soil. The train from Philadelphia carried her through a landscape she barely recognized. The songs of victory and emancipation filled the air in northern cities, but here, the silence was heavier. The Confederacy was gone, but its ghosts lingered in every tree, every scar on the land. Her husband, Samuel, had begged her not to return. "The past is dead," he said softly. "Don't wake it." But Catherine couldn't rest until she saw it for herself. The house, the fields, the graves, and the uncle who had rewritten her story into a lie. She arrived at the Caldwell estate in the late afternoon. What had once been the grand house on the hill now stood half-empty and weathered, its paint peeling, its windows shuttered. The air smelled of dust and memory. Edward Caldwell, her father's brother, still lived there, managing what was left of the land with a handful of hired hands. When he opened the door and saw her standing there, dressed plainly, her hair streaked with gray, her eyes still sharp with the fire of Catherine Caldwell, he went pale. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, he whispered, "My God, it's you." Inside the study, where her father's portrait still hung, their conversation began like a storm held back too long. Catherine demanded to know why he had buried the truth, why he had turned her story into a lie of abduction and shame. Edward's voice trembled between anger and guilt. "You left your father to die believing you were taken. You would have destroyed him, destroyed us." Catherine's reply was calm, but her words cut deep. "No, uncle. The truth destroyed him. The lie only preserved your pride." He tried to justify himself, speaking of family honor, of reputation, of the scandal it would have caused. But Catherine was unmoved. She told him about Samuel, not as a servant, but as her husband. About their children, their new life, the freedom they had built. Edward listened, his expression hardening. "You've shamed us all," he said finally. "No," she replied. "We freed ourselves." The confrontation lasted hours. The housekeeper later recalled hearing raised voices, the sound of something breaking, then silence. When Catherine finally emerged, her face was pale but resolute. She left behind no letter, no explanation. But Edward did. In a private letter written to his wife the next day, discovered nearly a century later, he described the meeting. "She came to reclaim her story. To tell me she was not stolen, but that she chose. I could not bear it. The shame, the truth, both too heavy to hold. I offered her money to keep silent. I think she pitied me for it." Catherine left Georgia the next morning, boarding a train north under her assumed name. She never returned. The Caldwell plantation was sold within 6 months. Edward withdrew to Charleston, where he lived in seclusion until his death. The lie he chose to protect the family's reputation became history, until time, as it always does, began to reveal what had been buried. Years later, when Catherine's descendants found her name in records, not as a victim, but as a rebel, they realized she had done more than escape. She had confronted the world that owned her and told it no. In that study, under her father's portrait, she did what few women of her time ever could. She reclaimed her truth, not for revenge, but for peace. For nearly a century, the story of the Caldwell twins lived only in whispers. In Wilkes County, people spoke of it as a cautionary legend, the tragic abduction of two plantation daughters by their enslaved men. It was told in church basements and on front porches, always with a shiver, always with a lie. But history, like truth, has a stubborn way of resurfacing. In 1952, during the renovation of a Georgia courthouse, a clerk stumbled upon a dusty box of old records sealed since before the Civil War. Inside was a yellowed letter written by a housekeeper named Margaret Sullivan. Her words were simple but startling. The young misses have been spending unusual amounts of time in the quarters. The master seems strangely unconcerned. It was the first crack in a century-old illusion. Over the following decade, more fragments surfaced, an entry in the county death register, an unexplained reference to a fire, a missing persons notice without conclusion. But it wasn't until 1964 that the truth began to take shape. That year, during the demolition of what remained of the Caldwell house, workers discovered a hidden compartment behind the wall of what had once been Catherine's bedroom. Inside was a small leather-bound diary, its pages brittle but legible. It began in 1846 and ended abruptly in March 1847. Within those pages, Catherine Caldwell, the victim of an abduction, told her own story. "I have been blind," she wrote, "not only to the suffering around me, but to the very meaning of what it is to be human. Samuel has opened my eyes, and now I cannot close them again, though the light sometimes pains me." Each entry painted a picture the South had long refused to see, not of seduction or crime, but of awakening. Love born not from rebellion for rebellion's sake, but from understanding, compassion, and the courage to cross an impossible boundary. Historians were stunned. Newspapers across Georgia reported the discovery with hesitant fascination. Lost Diary suggests different story of Caldwell disappearance. For the first time, the possibility was raised. The twins had not been taken. They had fled. Then, in 1966, another discovery reshaped everything. A journal found in a Philadelphia estate sale belonging to a man named Samuel Johnson. The writing matched Catherine's references exactly. Samuel, it turned out, had chronicled their escape, the night of the fire, the journey north, the terror of patrols, the breathless relief of freedom. One entry read, "Elizabeth spoke to the patrolman herself, claiming to be traveling to visit kin. Her voice never trembled. I saw in her courage the strength of all of us." Together, Catherine's diary and Samuel's journal bridged two sides of a silenced love story, one from privilege, one from bondage, both united in defiance. By 1968, historians located census records in Philadelphia listing a Samuel and Catherine Johnson, mulatto, with 3 children, and in Massachusetts, an Elijah and Elizabeth Davis with 2. Both families living quietly under assumed names, both marked as free. Letters between the sisters, later discovered in a descendant's attic, completed the portrait. They wrote of their children, of fear, of gratitude, of never daring to speak their real names. "Freedom," one letter read, "is a quiet thing. It lives not in noise or banners, but in the space where no one owns your name." By the late 1960s, scholars began to rewrite the history of the Caldwell incident, not as an abduction, but as one of the most remarkable acts of personal rebellion in the antebellum South. What had once been legend became testimony. What had once been shame became courage. And for the first time in 120 years, the world began to see Elizabeth and Catherine Caldwell not as victims of history, but as its authors. Time, it seems, has a way of softening even the sharpest truths. But some stories refuse to fade. They hum quietly beneath the surface of history, waiting for someone to listen. The story of the Caldwell twins, Elizabeth and Catherine, is one of those rare echoes. By the late 20th century, their tale had become more than an archival curiosity. It became a mirror, reflecting not just the world they defied, but the questions we still struggle to answer. Who decides what is right when society itself is wrong? And how much are we willing to risk for the chance to live freely and love freely? In 1969, when scholars presented their findings at the Georgia Historical Society, an elderly woman stood up in the back of the room. She introduced herself as the great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Davis. Her voice trembled as she said, "All my life, I was told my family came from the North. No one mentioned Georgia. No one mentioned slavery. Now I understand why." She wept, not from shame, but from pride. For the first time, descendants of both families began to piece together their shared past. Some preferred silence, unwilling to reopen wounds. Others embraced the story as a testament to courage, the courage to see another human being not as property or scandal, but as an equal soul. Over the years, researchers traced dozens of descendants across the United States, teachers, doctors, artists, most unaware of the extraordinary union that made their very existence possible. One of them, a historian herself, once said, "They didn't just escape slavery. They escaped the mindset that created it." That's the power of this story. It challenges the comfortable version of history, the one that divides good and evil neatly, that paints rebellion as sin and obedience as virtue. The Caldwell twins' choice didn't fit any of those boxes. It was messy, dangerous, human. Their love broke the rules of their world, but in doing so, it revealed something timeless, that freedom isn't a gift handed down, it's a choice wrestled from the darkness, often at great cost. Today, the Caldwell plantation is gone. Where the house once stood, a handful of oak trees remain, their roots tangled in the same red soil that once soaked up generations of pain and hope. A small metal marker by the roadside mentions the historic Caldwell estate, but not the daughters who defied it. Not the men who walked into the night beside them. And maybe that's fitting. Because this story was never meant to live in monuments or marble. It was meant to live in memory, in the quiet act of telling and retelling, of refusing to let truth stay buried. Historians still search for the missing box, the one that once held those handmade marriage certificates, the physical proof of their forbidden pact. Some believe it was destroyed. Others like to imagine it still exists somewhere, tucked inside a forgotten attic, waiting to be found, waiting for someone brave enough to open it. But perhaps it doesn't matter whether the box is ever found. Because the evidence that truly matters, the legacy, is already here. In their words, in their descendants, in the very idea that love, when met with courage, can rewrite history itself. In one of her final letters, Elizabeth wrote to her granddaughter, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. The world will tell you what is proper. Your heart will tell you what is right. Choose the latter, even when it costs you everything." And so, as we close this story, two sisters, two men, for souls bound by conscience, we are left with a question that belongs not to the past, but to us. If love demanded the same courage of you today, would you take that first step into the dark?